Welcome back, everyone, to On the Polis. Very happy to be with you this evening. Harivilasa Prabhu, myself, Deva Madhavadas, and we're happy to have Vrinda Sundari and Madan Gopal Prabhus. And today's discussion is going to be on power, an ever-present dynamic. We're not talking about solar power, though. We're talking about political, social power. A simple working definition that we're going to go off of this evening. Power as the ability to control people and events. And right away, that word control people might trigger some things. For some people, it certainly does for me. So I find it a kind of helpful framing also to move on this conversation with power. So just wanted to welcome all of our panel, Harivilasa, Vrinda Sundari, Madan Gopal. And we're going to kick it off. I'll just pose the kind of question to everybody. What's your gut reaction? What's your gut relationship to the word power when you hear it? We'll start with Harivilasa.
Well, I have to say my own experience of power dramatically shifted over the last few years. I would say since a young age, I was always avoided it, either being inflicted upon me or taking responsibility for it. For many, many years, I really tried to keep a low profile in life. And then that's what brought me to spirituality. It was the desire for freedom. It was really deeply rooted within me, the desire to be free. And then somehow, ironically, found myself again part of a movement, it's a religious movement, and then the same dynamic was there. The reality that there's an organization and there's some kind of a power structure and how to deal with it. And I've thought about it immensely and somehow tried to keep my freedom. And at a certain point, lo and behold, I got caught and I found myself successively taking more responsibility and actually having the responsibility to make decisions that influences people and events. And it has been quite a fascinating learning curve. So when I hear power, it's like, what does it say? It's like bittersweet, like in one hand, I recognize its importance, but at the same time, it is always something that makes it a little uncomfortable because I know it's just such a pivotal thing that can go either one way or the other.
So a little pensive, but there's some sense of possibility also. Vrinda Sundari.
Yeah, similar to Harivilasa. I think I used to think of power as a negative thing that would be grouped into greed, a bad desire to want to control. But similarly, getting into taking on responsibilities, it led me to understand that power is closely related to empowerment, and it's just a force, and that it can move through us, and it's up to us how we utilize it, and that determines whether it's positive or negative, whether it's destructive or progressive. So, it's what we do with it, and I don't necessarily have that negative feeling anymore after taking on responsibility.
I like it. It seems like you're indicating everyone has some power and kind of taking responsibility for it, which I like, and hopefully we'll get to later on in the conversation. Not that power is with a certain group of people and not with others. Madan Gopal, what's your gut reaction when you hear power?
Yeah, in the Bhagavad Gita, there's that one little painting. I used to read the Gita when I was little and didn't really read it. I used to look at the paintings. And the one painting of the four people who never surrender to God. There's one general, he's standing like this, and he's painted like, power hungry, power greedy kind of personality. And that's what reminds me of that. It's the thing. It attracts the very people who shouldn't be having any. So power to do that. And why is that? What is their motivation for that? Maybe they, makes them feel good, but then, it destroys, they'll do anything to hurt other people that don't care. But then there's also that other famous saying, with great power comes great responsibilities. Famous Spider-Man movie back in, I think, 2001 that came out. And then, but actually that's attributed to, I think it was Shakespeare, or even in the Bible, that to whom much is given, much is expected, so that's there in Luke. So there's a lot of understanding that all of us have power. So if you look at the Spider-Man example, right? He doesn't want to be the ruler of the world, but because somehow or other, he has these abilities that can do so much. he has to now figure out, well, his uncle tells him, figure out, you can do so much for the world. And you can do so much bad or so much good because you have so much. The power is a form of energy of the Lord. So if you have a lot of energy can be used to destroy or used to build up something. So then responsibility is where you take the energy that's been given to you, either through political structure or just abilities, and that's power. Is great ability. He might be empowered right now, but people will recognize this person can do great things. At some point, he or she will be in power. So then we have to think that we all have some power, and am I using it for something good? And then when I take the responsibility, am I shirking from it? As Krishna has given me, so God has given me opportunities, So that's as I grew up more, I figured there's a lot more to it than just that simple idea of someone who's power hungry.
Yeah, just the overlord trying to control everybody. That caricature. Yeah, I love how you use that word responsibility and having that vision of my power. And it reminds a theme that we've been threading through this On the Polis discussion, just to kind of bring in some principled philosophical angles to discuss the dynamics in society. There's an American philosopher, John Locke, who is largely one of the principal people that brought in the conception that the founding fathers then used to bring out American democracy, which has been exported all over the world. So many people have experienced this to some degree, his influence. And he discusses two different dynamics, natural law and natural rights. And when one is considering natural law, they're seeing how they are responsible to creating an experience of universal principles. And experience of universal principles is what we would call dharma. We're all bhakti yogis, and that's what we're interested in, is helping people experience directly the truth of existence. And when you get into discussing natural rights, that's when there's a sense of entitlement, that I deserve certain things, and what certain things I deserve, it's a slippery slope to go down, that I deserve money and more of it, and I deserve influence and fame and more of it. And I think that speaks to that caricature version that you were speaking about. And I'm myself hoping to step into that responsible idea of power. So I'd like to now hear from each of you, because I should have mentioned also at the beginning, each of our panel today, they're all in positions of power within a spiritual institution, which is a tricky place to hold power, especially in 2021, as much as folks don't like religious institutions. So I'd like to know why each of you are very intelligent people. Would you get yourself into such a difficult and underappreciated situation, holding power within a religious institution? So how did you find yourself in that service? What keeps you there? What are you learning that allows you to stay afloat? And we'll keep it open, whoever wants to jump on it first.
Well, I have to say that I was tricked, to tell you the truth. I first came to New York City. I was supposed to just come for 2 months. So I just came to this temple, sort of a temple that had a lot of work to be done and not so many people. So I came to assist my spiritual teacher. And he asked me to come and just be his secretary. So I was like, oh, okay, trip to America, that sounds exciting. and I was supposed to just be for 2 months, but slowly which I believe obviously was his plan all the while, I just got involved. And like I came here and I helped the place, and I was, you sort of start just getting entangled in the whole thing. You start looking at it and you see everything that needs to be done. And you also see the potential and the opportunities. And most of all, you see the people, because you see this like people who are living here and they're trying their best to do something. And somehow I just got swept up in the cause, get swept up in the idea. And then I was, at a certain point, I just had to make the decision. I'm like, okay, I'm willing to come and take some responsibility in this project. And that's sort of the interesting dynamic. It's not something I was looking for. Just got caught, swept up. But as I say, there was a vacancy, and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or in the right place at the right time. And but I have to say, it's my first serious responsibility, I would say, specifically, actually in life, to tell you the truth. My first big responsibility of this magnitude. And I would not trade it for anything, even though it was definitely intense so far, and it probably will still be. But one gets so many wonderful things have come, and I can't really think of anything that can equal the amount of personal growth, at least. How successful I've been as a leader, that is who you can ask different people, they'll give you different estimations. But at least my own personal growth I've seen as not being, nothing can actually come to that. Nothing has actually given me this amount of forward momentum.
Thank you. And we're all glad that you got tricked out of South Africa or wherever you were previously, and now helping us out here in the States. We need it desperately. Madan Gopal Prabhu, you're in charge of a burgeoning project in northern Jersey, multi-million-dollar temple being constructed. You're the kind of lead on that project. A lot of responsibility, a lot of influence. What's that experience like for you?
Yeah, it's been overwhelming, certainly. Thankfully, I'm not the president, but I am, the director of communications at our temple. And then from that, I also took on the role of, I'm also now co-director of communications of ISKCON in North America. So that kind of grew into that. So communication was my big thing, but I wasn't really into it at first. Like Prabhuji, I was kind of tricked. I've been a member of a congregation for 8-9 years. I was happy, teaching Sunday school, teaching little kids. And some of my kids have grown up and they have kids of their own. You remember Namaras? Namaras was one of my students. So.
We have you to thank.
So I was just happy doing that, and then some people said, you should join our temple management meetings. I'm like, I'm really not into that. No, please come. I think you'll be great. Your communication skills, So I started attending one of those, and then those who were in charge kind of left, and I was kind of got more and more in charge. So it just kind of happened like that, I pulled into it, and then, if what needs to be done, you have to rush in and do it, So that's I'd say that's the art of like servant leadership. Hey, you praying to Krishna, engage me in your service. Well, this is an opportunity. Now you serve, you do this part, you write that press release, and you make contact with the mayor, and all of a sudden you're the communications person, because there's never anybody else who did that, So it was great. I know the mayor knows me, and he came to our foundation stone ceremony, and so everything is history after that. So we had some great successes one after another, and I guess it's about servant leadership. That's something that kind of creeps upon you. That look, you're praying to be serving, and serving means you take some responsibility, whether it's a micro responsibility or slightly bigger. And at some point, if it's big enough, you can label it with power, whatever you want to call it. Like when the Sundari said, empowerment is really where it's at. That's really such a more positive way of looking at it. That when you step beyond your comfort zone, then Krishna comes and empowers us to work in that discomfort zone.
I'm noticing a theme. Maybe Vrinda will pick up on it or take us a different direction. We have two reluctant leaders who just saw a need and filled it, and looked around and realized they'd been put much higher than they expected to be.
Yeah, I mean, how it started for me was my husband was asked to be the temple president, and I just assumed that meant that I would support him in the service, and yeah, that's what it meant. Although what I found was is that the definition or the job description of wife of the temple president had so many varieties of definitions. There were so many varieties that it got a little confusing, and also got a bit messy. So, but what I could see was there were certain things that he was skilled in or is skilled in that I'm not, and then there's certain things that I was skilled in, and I realized like, oh, I could be helping out here, and so I just slowly started helping with this and that, and then. At the same time as when I was having children, we have 2 children, and I could see that being a mother, it went parallel for me going into this position. It was, becoming a parent
that's a lot to take on.
Yeah, it's a high level of responsibility, and so it went parallel. So I had sort of like parallel realizations or simultaneous realizations in both, seeing that. Oh my God, I need to take care of this person. They're completely dependent on me. If I don't really like pull through on this and like keep my cool and focus, then like they could die, they could get hurt, and I care about them. And so it was similar with with the temple, it was, when we first arrived, it was a very bare bones crew, and I could see it just needed some TLC. So I thought okay, I can help with this, I can help with that. But getting into it more and more, it was like, oh, you take off one layer, oh, I can help with this, and this needs work, and help with that, oh, this needs attention, and this needs attention, and then all of a sudden it's like these things are on me now. Although in and of themselves, they're not fully dependent on us, but there's a sense of responsibility that if I don't do this, who will? And how will it be? And so it's brought me to feel the closest I've ever felt to my spiritual guides and mentors and teachers and, the predecessors, that's really why I continue, even though there's so much grittiness and pain that comes in the service, that I just think why else would anyone want to do this? There's no other reason why, really.
No other wholesome reason, maybe.
No.
And I appreciate each of you have shared this kind of reluctance. I can be the one power hungry amongst us that I was eager to go run my own show because I was, I wanted to know and show that I could do that. And it was very sobering to realize what all of that meant. It's much more than I expected. And similar to you, I remember the first time this young man was sitting across from me and he had $10,000 in savings, and he just wanted to give it to me just because I was the guy in charge and, the leader there. And that's what you're supposed to do in his, budding idea of what it means to surrender yourself to a spiritual community. And when that fell in my lap, I didn't take it, but it was like, oh, that's possible, that this kind of abnegation of self is what people want to do to people in power sometimes. And it was very sobering for me as to the responsibility and what I'm being entrusted to do and be for others and what I want that to look like. And as each of you were speaking, I was wondering, what does a healthy power dynamic actually look like? I think that'd be useful to bring out, because each of you touched on in different ways that power has a kind of negative connotation. There's a negative idea around it. And yet there seems to be also this need for power to be present. You need somebody to be in charge. You need somebody to take responsibility. It's an essential element within any organization, community, etc. And yet there's so much reluctance and negativity around it. So what does actually a healthy power dynamic look like?
I can probably verbalize one or two ideas that are coming to my mind, that when there is a very strong culture of a serve first mentality, that service first, do this, get something done. For example, something is broken, or say the ceiling is cracked in one room in the temple, and I need 8 devotees to help me work on that. If I'm the first one there with the gloves in my hand and also helping, get the resources together and all, but if I'm right in there, serve first, showing, exemplifying and feeling the sense of urgency. Because actually, spirituality is about empathy, feeling the pain of others. So if as a leader, I can feel the pain and then demonstrate that, hey, I'm feeling the pain, I'm driven by this feeling that, Maharaj is going to sleep in this room, or whoever VIP guests are going to sleep in this room, and this is terrible, and it's so sad that we can't put something together. It's nice. And so I feel strongly, and then if I can exude that, and everybody else starts resonating with that feeling, then at that point, I'm just a point person for people to ask questions. Hey, where's the paint? Where's this? That's it. Actually powerful ideal leader is one who is somewhat not very visible, but at the same time accessible and provides what needs. So that's like a serve first. There's a servant leader where you're at the bottom and people are coming to you just for asking things where to go. But they're also empowered and feeling like they're also leaders. It's just
Yeah, the lead by example dynamic. And it reminds me, there's a beautiful characterization of a person in the Bhagavatam, Prithu Maharaj, one of the famous kings of Vedic history. And it's said that he gave the effort which he gave to public works was the same that you would expect from somebody endeavoring in their own private life. So the way he worked for the public was the way the public works only for themselves. And in that way, he was showing an exemplary way of carrying himself as a leader. And it enjoined exactly what you said, that there's this desire for the public to reciprocate with that mood of service. So I love that characterization there. Harivilasa, how about yourself?
Well, I must say, one of the things that really shifted one of my conceptions towards power in general was when you enter into a big organization that's especially a dysfunctional one, that one is not functioning properly, then you see the chaos that is created if no one is in power. It's like, who's supposed to do this? It's like, we don't know. And then you just see how much comes when no one takes power, because I find it a power, I think it's almost like Madam Gopal was saying, or somebody was saying, it's just something that's lying there, sort of like gold or whatever. It's like it's just like lying, it's like a live electric current cable that's lying there. And it's like someone can pick it up. And if no one picks it up, then you see also the chaos that ensues. So that's that first principle, is to understand that. And that really also helped me. We read so much in the Vedic literature, not just the Vedic literature, we read any kind of like a lot of pre-Christian traditions. They all have this idea of the demigods, the Devatas, or like this idea that the whole world, there's some conscious control behind every facet of the world. And when
There's a hierarchy.
Exactly. But when you enter into organization, it starts to make sense, because you realize, like everything, there has to be conscious attention around even the smallest things. Like, who will take the groceries downstairs into the kitchen? It's like, even this, every single detail, there has to be some attention to it. So that's really the thing to understand. It's just also this functional dynamic. Like, if no one takes responsibility, then it won't happen. And before I came to New York City, I read, I was trying to sort of get into the moods. I read some biographies of well-known people in New York, and I was reading about some of the people who were behind the big construction work, like the bridges and the roads. And then you realize, because you sort of think it just comes sort of, they sit together, they make a plan, and then they say, okay, we build this bridge. But then you realize behind every single one of those bridges, someone had to fight for those resources. Someone had to believe that this is the thing that needs to be done. Yeah. So to this world, it actively resists, it positively resists any kind of effort that humans will invest on it. So therefore, some power is needed to have anything happen. So that's the first, just my practical understanding. Listen, if without it, nothing will happen. And if nothing happens, then you see the chaos that ensues in other people's lives. And then the next question will come, why would you do it? And exactly like Madam Gopal was saying also, that principle is, at least for myself, I find that because my natural nature is not one that I'm not naturally trying to get involved, I'm naturally trying to disinvolve. That's my natural tendency is toward trying to cut the responsibilities and move backward. So for myself, what I need to do to stay connected is I have to consciously stay connected to the people, because that's what hits me. Like if I see something fold because I didn't take responsibility, and then I see some other people get inconvenienced by it, that's the thing, at least for myself, that moves me. Like, oh man, so many things happen, and then you see other people that are influenced by your own the fact that you didn't take responsibility. That's, at least for me, something I found the most positive of motivations. At least it gets me going towards to at least stick to that responsibility when you perceive the people that will be influenced by your actions or lack thereof.
Yeah, you're sobered by the effect you have on others. I love that. And to that other point you were saying previously about the power and just if no one takes the initiative, I think it's a very important thing to recognize in the present political situation, really across the globe. There's dissatisfaction in the social body. And so there's a kind of tendency, we're being abused by the powers that be. And so we're trying to now get rid of the power dynamic in society altogether. There's a kind of shallow idea that that's what will help. And that's in many ways worse off than having a bad power, is having somebody with, a vacuum of power Just Iraq is one modern political example. Saddam Hussein was a jerk, but when he was removed, then you had 30 jerks come in and take the place over, and they run it like a mafia, like a gangster, wonderland. So that vacuum of power is so difficult, and ideally we have somebody who's responsible stepping in, but the solution to bad power is not to take away power. So I really appreciate you bringing that out, Harivilasa.
An interesting note, if we look at in the Bhagavatam, for example, you were speaking about the experience of Prithu, then you see that story of how they tell the story of a bad king.
Yes.
King, and then they were like, they could see that, wow, this person is really not suited for leadership, but they decided, rather a bad king than no king, because that was even worse. In the ancient times, like to have no king was like the worst thing.
Yeah, that's...
So it's very interesting you're saying, like that vacuum of power causes more complications.
Yeah, just invites the lowest class of people to exploit and take advantage. Bernice, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'm really appreciating this discussion. There are two things that I was thinking, and Harivilasa, he brought this up, and you're continuing on, basically about empowerment, because a conduit is just like we are meant to be conduits of power. Basically, we all have it. I mean, the soul is powerful, and so we're meant to actually let that power come through. But it's how is it healthy and how is it unhealthy is depending on the conduit. And yes, like you're saying, like it is important that the power come through, even if the conduit is, broken or messed up in some way or dysfunctional, that still the power needs to come through, or else it's worse off. So that was the one thing I was thinking. The other thing is when we think of power as a collective whole, that is, if everyone is utilizing to the fullest extent their talents and skills, they're fully empowered, and everyone's adding to the collective whole as individuals, then we'll get back what we give. We'll get back more than what we give in, the more people are contributing. So it's so important that everyone actually owns their power, comes to more awareness and understanding what their power is, and not shy away from it, like we may tend to, depending on what belief systems and paradigms we've been exposed to or cultivated in, or how we interpret scriptures that we read, or different things.
I love that point. And it leads me, I wanted actually to discuss also this idea of absolute power, which we really don't see. I was just looking at political cartoons because that's one of the ways I like to get ready for these discussions. And there was a cartoon from the New Yorker, and it is a guy, and he's like sitting at his desk. He's the powerful guy. You can tell he's got a window behind him, and he's fat, and he's got a tie, and he's big desk. And his secretary, who's like a small sniveling looking little guy, comes in, and he says, absolute power is on line 1, and his banker is on line 2. Absolute power doesn't have absolute power. If you have a banker, you don't have absolute power because somebody's pulling the strings behind you. So again, speaking of the kind of modern democratic ideal, the founding fathers of America had this idea of separation of powers. And the stagnation and the lack of movement in today's political circumstance is actually largely intentional. That they made a system that was very hard to move. And after that system has been around for 200 plus years, then it's even harder to move it, a lot of rust and decay. And so in your experience, what is the healthy power dynamic in the structured way? Because we also have this idea of separation of powers spiritually and materially, and then within the institution. And so how does one navigate that to recognize your own healthy relationship to bringing power and being powered over, to put it in direct terms, right? That somebody's in charge of me, my banker's on the other line, and I'm accountable to them. How does one see themselves within that larger scheme of hierarchy that ultimately has been made by the Absolute, by Krishna? Let's, Vrinda, I'm going to put it to you first, since you've gone last a few times.
Yeah. Yeah, it's natural that there's hierarchy. And usually what it means is, well, not usually what it means, but how it is when we see with descriptions of the management of the universe, that those that are in higher positions have more responsibility to care for those that are below them. And that those of us that are in whatever position we're in, that we honor and we receive mercy, we basically receive resources and empowerment from those that have more than us, and then we care for those that have less than us. And so as each of us as conduits, we may have different degrees or levels of power and in different ways. So yeah, a healthy hierarchy means that there's a reciprocation with those of us that have less, those of us that have more, in a way that it's all working together harmoniously. And the responsibility is heavy. It's heavy when we need to care for others. And some of them may not feel that we're actually doing it very well. And they may feel that we're not doing a good job. They may feel that we're not qualified. But yeah, a healthy hierarchy is interdependent, whereas unhealthy is when there's a codependence, when someone is not complete in and of themselves without somebody else. So I think healthy hierarchical a form is actually interdependent, which relates to Varnashram.
Yeah, totally.
It's interdependence.
I love that relation.
Yeah, and we can go further in talking about what is codependence, what is independence. I mean, there's no true independence in the sense that everything we're receiving for our life is coming from some other place, and there's no true dependence because ultimately we are our own entity. So interdependence is where independence and dependence find their healthy reality.
And again, speaking to the kind of modern ideal, the whole of America is founded on this idea of rugged individualism. Independence Day. In fact, I am independent, and I don't need you or anyone else to live out my best life. And our experience of that is quite opposite, right? That actually where I'm fulfilled and happy is when I do feel connected and to some degree dependent, but also to another degree depended on. And yeah, thank you so much for bringing that out. Madan Gopal Prabhu, what are your thoughts on this idea of what is the healthy hierarchy dynamic, the power structure and maybe how to find your own space in that?
Yeah. He coined the phrase, the buck stops here. It's a very famous term we use all the time. The buck stops here. That means I'm the final word in some aspects of it. So there is a place for a person who is the final decider. Decider is a word coined by our famous George W. Bush. I'm the decider for that. And that's recognized in a Vedic system too, in the monarchy system, where a person does have absolute power. But a proper monarchy is where it's a benevolent dictatorship, where the person is guided by higher principles, by advisors or the sages, and we're well versed in what's to be done, what is moral, what is sacred, and so on. And there's that hierarchy there. So then Srila Prabhupada, our founder, also wanted to place that structure or aspects of that structure in the institution as well. I think that's important. Like, for example, the temple president model, right? Where there's one person, but the temple president was elected, actually. There's a democracy there. And Prabhupada would even say that, look, I'm also going to give him my vote. You guys all voted for him, and you have to listen to him, even though some things, So there is something to be said for a person, even though he may be a little bit, not make maybe decision that not everybody's happy with, but if we keep bickering about every decision and say we should make everything in a committee, it can slow us down also. So we need to have that balance between, an individual person taking charge at the same time taking input. So we have to strike that balance, taking input enough from and being open-hearted enough to take that sort of guidance from the wise ones or in general population. So they should have that kind of thing. But not everything can be decided by committee. It said that committee starts to, camel is what you get when a committee designs a horse. Everybody, puts their own idea, and you end up with this camel thing, right? So there are certain advantages to having a person who can make quick decisions, because sometimes they need to be made quick. They need to be executive and decisive. So decisiveness has value. So we do need to strike that balance, so that at least big amount of, at least there's general satisfaction with the model among the society. Otherwise, nobody wants to be part of it.
Yeah, wonderful point, that just because somebody has the power to make the decision as the executive doesn't mean they make a decision exclusively for their own purposes, exclusively for what's convenient for them. That the ideal decision maker is the one that's able to consider everybody's best interest and then move in the direction that is actually in harmony with that.
Right. And the person who's making the decision has to have confidence that, hey, I'm a servant, and if I don't have this position, it's also fine. If you have that sort of confidence and detachment from that position, then you can actually govern a lot better. This John Steinbeck had the famous saying that, absolute power does not corrupt. It's actually fear that corrupts. The fear of losing the power. So it's an interesting dynamic that if you're suffering from insecurity, that's really the root of corruption in power. So you should have a sense of, somehow I got this, I'm servant.
Wonderful point. And I always found it very unique. It's part of the Lord's arrangement. Krishna put Srila Prabhupada in the middle of Richard Nixon's social circumstance in America, when just unprecedented social situation of a president being kicked out of office in modern times, all over news media, television, etc. And Srila Prabhupada had him as a foil to speak to in so many of his purports, comparing this mood of a real king, a real leader who's reluctant to be in the position of power and thinking themselves only a servant, not the burden isn't worth it otherwise, and juxtaposing that next to this guy whose only sense of existence was, let me maintain power at whatever cost. And he lived in a constant paranoia that ironically drove him out of power, because he was, willing to compromise any principle to keep that post, even though he wasn't fit to serve in it. So excellent framing there. Harivilasa Prabhu, what are your ideas on this power dynamic and how to find the healthy integration of this hierarchy and ourselves within it?
Sure. I remember at the point of starting to take responsibility, I really started to look for resources to understand this thing. Because, and then you can look at the world, and there's so many variety of ways you can approach it. You can go read Machiavelli or whatever. Many people have something to say about how to use and maximize power. But then I was, especially myself, listen, this stuff is not, I would like to be interested in to see how the spiritual approach towards power. And therefore I started to look at the Bhagavatam, which is one of our main texts, because I was thinking this must explain to me how to do this. It's just like
you're right.
The Krishna incarnate, and everything is in there that you need to sort of successfully navigate through life. So I started to look at the Bhagavatam through that perspective, and I found so many interesting lessons there. So the first thing, specifically the thing that I'm thinking about when you ask this question about the proper relationship, in the fourth canto of the Bhagavatam, there's the story of Prithu, which you also mentioned. So Prithu is considered to be like the ideal administrator, and it's even said to be the embodiment of God's ability, of God's administrative power. Shakti Avesh Avatar, specifically empowered being. That's just like the empowerment of the guy who can take care of business. And but then there's this very fascinating exchange, which is very peculiar of the Bhagavatam itself, is that most of the Bhagavatam, it's like a split between stories and dialogue, where people would have, a lot of it is prayers towards God, but in this case there is the dialogue between Prithu, where he speaks to his citizens. He actually addresses his citizens. He addresses the people that are under his power. Very fascinating. And then there's this one amazing point where he basically says that somehow I now have the scepter of power. I have the scepter of power in my hand. But then he basically asks his citizens, he says that, he asks them two things. The one thing he says, if you perform your duties towards God, you have to do that out of a sense of mercy towards me, because I can only be successful if you actually perform your duty, which is fascinating. So this understanding, like you were speaking about the interdependence, and that's exactly it. The irony is that the leader, he is subordinate, and his success is subordinate in one sense to the actions of the people that he's leading. So you're not really in a position, you're not controlling people. They, in one sense, control your success, which is very frightening if one sees it, if one understands that success is in reference to the pleasure of God. So I found it very interesting that really shifted a few things for me as I read them. This is the secret to understanding enlightened hierarchies, or Vedic hierarchies, that the success, people actually, the success of both are dependent on one another. And in that prayers also, he asked his citizens as well to see past him. He says, please understand that the duties I'm trying to help you perform, they come from God. They come from something higher. I'm simply trying to help you. It's not that I'm thinking this is what you're supposed to do. I'm simply trying to help you perform your duty. And I found it a very fascinating thing. And as you were speaking about, she was speaking about this idea that everybody has power, I just had this image in my head of how, in one sense, the whole hierarchy, it's full. It's like the whole thing is filled with power. And but each of us, we can only take a little. And if you're high at the top, you're taking a little, but everybody else has to fill in that all the things that need to be done, all that responsibility that makes up the project. And I have to tell you, one of my biggest challenges in management now is that of trying to, I realize that you can only do so much yourself, and being willing to sort of surrender to the fact that, if other people do things, it won't be done. And it really, it's quite interesting. And then, so that's what I think this sort of codependence, but then at the same time, to understand, to bring in Madan Gopal's Prabhu's point, that one has to understand, Prabhupada also makes this point, that to think that the government is for the people, he says that is a demoniac idea. So the understanding is that the success of your leadership depends on your superiors, if they are pleased with you or not. And that really is also a shift for me to make, because people, if you take position of responsibility, some people will hate you. It is inevitable. That is how it goes in the world. And so to be able to understand that the success of my position, to be able to go back and ask my spiritual teacher, are you happy with what I'm doing? And if he says yes, to understand it, okay, then that's my success. And even if other people are not necessarily exactly happy with you. So that is a big shift to take, to understand that your ultimate allegiance is not towards the desire of everyone, but it's towards the desire of God and then his representative. And that actually takes quite some adjustment to make to. And we see that people who are, if you're overly concerned with specifically what people think of you, it's very difficult actually to keep that higher perspective in mind. So dependence on people, but at the same time, depending on understanding that if they don't do what they're going to do, you're going to suffer, but at the same time, understand who you're ultimately accountable for. So those two things have to come together.
Wonderful. Just reflecting on what all of you have shared, and I want to get to the haters in a moment. I want to give us a little time to discuss that experience. I know we've all had it. And I want to conclude, just to frame it, asking how spiritual organizations of all kinds, and we're all part of ISKCON ourselves, but any spiritual organization we can see right now in the world, the spiritual organizations are losing in our efforts to really make impact in society. And that's our responsibility. That's what we're here to do. That's what we say we have the capacity for. So how can a spiritual organization have a healthier relationship to power? But just reflecting on what you all said, when I was thinking about the infrastructure needed, it's exactly that. That's what I was coming to as a kind of rounding out, was that there needs to be a framework of accountability. And we're especially lucky as practitioners of bhakti that there's a really clear conception of divinity. And the principles of what it means to be aligned with divinity are not vague. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is the scripture of all scriptures, no matter what tradition you come from, it's inarguably the most exhaustive and detailed, and the principles are universal. It's very reassuring in one sense that this is the benchmark for everybody, and no matter what position we might have, if we're not lining up with these universal values and principles, then we're a joke, then we're a problem, and we deserve to be told as much. And somebody is a leader to the extent that they're creating an atmosphere where others can experience and develop those principles in themselves. I liked how you said that, Madan Gopal. You know that you're doing well when you can just step back, when you can just remove yourself from the situation. And something I tell myself about leadership, a kind of reframing from how I used to think of it, is that the leader is not the star of the show, as I used to think, but the one that creates a show that others can star in. That's the real expression of healthy leadership. So now going to the haters, so to speak, those who have a problem with what the powers that be are doing, how have you all been able to weather that inevitable storm as it comes? Because there's, as you said, Harivilasa, no matter who you are and what you're doing, and I look sometimes myself, it's like Krishna got criticized. my spiritual master gets criticized. So who am I to think that I'm not going to get criticized and complained about? And oftentimes I've learned from those criticisms, but we're just going to take the benefit of the doubt for our own sake and say there's oftentimes we're criticized unduly, or by people who themselves are having things to look at first before they look outside. They need to be looking more inside. How have you handled that? How do you deal with that? How do you approach that? Especially when that someone is somebody kind of in the community, so to speak, somebody involved in your power framework. They're not just off in the land of Facebook or social media, but there's somebody kind of woven into the fabric of the community that you're in. How do you navigate that? Not everybody all at once.
I'm not going first on this one.
Madan Gopal, master of communication. We'll let him take it for us.
Yeah, well, there is this notion of haters gonna hate. So that's the universal principle, that there's, fault finder can find fault in Vaikuntha if he's placed. So that element will always be there, and every community has one or two voices that are like that. And so it is something that has to be dealt with depending on the intensity and level of damage, because that can come out appropriately. So there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, there's also this other understanding that where there is smoke, there's some fire. So if 2 or 3 different people are constantly criticizing one particular aspect of my service that I'm doing, then it should certainly give me some pause to reflect that, hey, maybe there's some truth to it. It doesn't matter. Maybe his motivations are not the best, but I need to improve in certain areas, that maybe my communication or my ability to stay on top of certain things was so bad over the last 2 years that I've left a lot of things fall through the cracks. And as a responsibility, that's something I might need to improve on, and so that's something, there's always a devotee who's progressive tries to leverage everything. Leverage meaning that if something good comes in, leverages the energy of that good to make progress. And if something bad gets, light shown on, then leverage that too, and figure out how that can be improved. And because there's always room for improvement. So the haters are going to hate that aspect. It's also there. We can ignore them, but there's also always something to learn from there, and also to learn from the personal dynamics of why are there certain people in your group who are feeling this energy all the time. Maybe there's deeper there too, because the devotees who come in our circle, it's a big group. We have 250 members in our community, 300 members, right? And out of which, 60 or 70 are really core people. And so they've given their lives to this. So, their motivation is more or less in the right place. But it's good to kind of understand as much as possible where some of the negative angles are coming from, and some introspection is always due. So we need to do both: learn to ignore what needs to be ignored, but also take seriously what needs to be taken seriously. That requires some finesse, I'm sure. Get better.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. Not necessarily just dismissing it because somebody has said something critical of me, but maybe there's an opportunity in there to learn and grow. Vrindasundari, you have something for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. We have to, like Madan was saying, that we have to reflect and see, okay, how is this situation? What am I learning? Is there something that I need to adjust? And then also know that the nature of this world is sometimes I feel like this place is like a cesspool of envy. Like, oh, get me out. You know, oh, it's so gross. I can't move. You know, but it's the nature of the world. And you know, a few things mentors have told me, which, you know, this is something that I continue to struggle with, because the desire to be liked runs so deep in me that it burns. It burns when I get criticized. It burns, and I feel like, oh, I'm just not understood. I'm just not understood. And I think there's a level of truth to that. That if they hadn't really seen my side, or maybe they wouldn't go to these places. But mentors have taught me, like, one thing is to know that when someone's speaking, 95% of the time it's about them and their experience. So one thing that I practice inside myself is to, like, sort of pretend like that I'm actually talking with them and thinking, like, okay, what's going on in your world, and how can I, like, reword this to help me understand that it really is about them and their experience. And then what part of this is really mine? A lot of the times it's not really us. So yeah, balancing that, like, how much of this is what we are a part of, what's our responsibility, and how much of this is just basically like hearing people and just letting their stuff be theirs. But it burns. I mean, I gotta be real about this. Like, I think that for many people, the desire to be liked is just, it runs deep.
Yeah.
It hurts. It hurts, especially when it's, oh, you're not taking responsibility, but like, you know, I'm the one getting criticized.
Totally.
Okay, you do this. Let's just
stand here.
You come in and then, like, give it a couple months, and then let's see if it's still the same opinion.
Give it a couple hours. Haribo. Yeah, I want to come back to something you said just when I share my own reflection, but let's see, maybe Harivilasa has something first.
Yeah, well, we know that very interesting. Robert once explained that there's in a literature that our philosophy is that the whole expanse of human experience can be engaged it can be connected to God's service. And it's the fascinating nature of bhakti, is that we say anything, anger, even lust, whatever it is, like desire, all these things, we're not afraid of to say, yes, bring it on. We can properly funnel it. We can find some proper outlet for it. But what is interesting, that envy is at one place, it actually cannot be accommodated. It cannot be engaged. This has to be abandoned. That's the interesting thing with envy. And it is actually the big challenge for living beings. And I find, even for myself, I think that even if you know, everything is a failure and my project, and, you know, whatever, it ends in total disgrace, and I get, you know, I dishonorably discharge my duty, whatever, the one thing that will at least be there is that I'm now myself much more averse to criticizing those in positions of responsibility. The interesting thing. Like, I think that's like the greatest benefit that comes from taking responsibility. Because I used to be like, walking into the temple, you walk into the temple, it's like, God, these people just can't get it together. Look at this. If I was in charge of this place, I tell you, I would do it like this, I would do it like that. Why don't they just do this? And then you realize, well, it's not so easy. So I think that's the great benefit of doing that, is taking responsibility. You become much more understanding of the reality behind it. And yeah, like Madame Prabhu says, it's this thing, like, just this criticism, I just take it as information. I take it as it's like a signal. It's like pain in the body. It's not pleasant, but I have to see what's paining. Is it just like a false, or is it something that's actually really indicative? But I have one friend of mine. His father is a well-known writer, and also, actually, this advice has come from another person I also know, who's a movie director, and he says that, you know, especially in the creative worlds, you have to learn. You shouldn't get into it. Like, if there's a bad review, don't like sit and reread the thing over and over again, and it can crush you. So I think a certain sense of at least for myself, my policy was that I try to create really open communication channels as far as possible, so that if someone really has a complaint, that it's easy for them to reach. And then I just try to focus on those things, because those things that happen behind, that's oftentimes you have to get into it. Like I had one person who used to come and tell me, like one person used to always come and tell me what other people are saying, because he was like just trying to. And at a certain point, I said, "Listen, I don't really want to know." Write an email. Just tell them if they have a real issue. If they can write me an email, I can see if I can address it. But I don't want to know. I don't want the information couched in all that other stuff that comes. People attack you as a person. But one thing that I should say that I've at least experienced here is that, at least now, I've seen that people, if you can actually continue performing your duty, a certain amount of people can shift also. That is fascinating. Like I've seen sometimes people that have some serious difficulties personally, but then I just continue doing my thing and I don't get upset. And at a later stage, it actually shifted where, so I find that interesting too. At least if you don't react, there's the potential in the future that things could go for the better. But if you react badly, then you can sort of really seal, and then that thing will never be solved. So at least neutrality allows for a future where potentially there can be a change of heart. But yeah, that definitely is. Even you can see, it's like many of the services in Krishna consciousness and spiritual life, in our community, even coming to the society the first time to also join a movement that is actively reaching out with its knowledge. We don't sit in the temple and just be peace. We actually go out and try to give it to other people, and it's the same thing. The pain of rejection and the pain of going out and people not really. What can I say, like really being happy about you doing what you're supposed to be doing. So it is interesting that it does seem to be a phenomenon, that it is this somehow there in true spiritual service. One oftentimes encounters this dynamic of having to abandon, like Kierkegaard, he said how one in a truly spiritual path, one has to abandon the fear of man and pick up the fear of God, meaning that the criteria by which you judge yourself should be the criteria of God. God's criteria should be the criteria by which you form your own estimation of yourself and what you're doing, and not the fear of man. And that fear of man, one has to choose. You can only have one master. Either serve the conception of your spiritual teachers and what they expect you to do, or you serve the image that you want to build up, that other people want to like you. And these two things go in radically separate paths, very different directions they will take you in.
Excellent point. That we're beholden to divinity, as we've said now several times, and that what I was reflecting when Vrinda was sharing about, the need to feel liked. I also have a deep need to be liked. I think it's not uncommon. And what I noticed about, oftentimes one of the criticisms or apprehensions around taking position of power, or the concerns, is that you'll get intoxicated by all of the glory and the position and the fame and attention it brings you. And certainly I've experienced some of that, and I've seen it happen to others also. And this element of criticism, often what I've noticed, frankly, when I've tried to do what Madan Gopal says and just look at it and see if there's something there, I often notice, there is something there, but it's not nearly as bad as what they've said. And so it's caused me to also appreciate all of the praise is also nearly not as good as what they've said. And my actual position within the framework of divinity is something much different from what most people have to say about it, including myself. So when that criticism comes in, it's an opportunity to stay sober. And I'm not that bad, but I'm also not that good. I'm somewhere much more in the middle. And that it's actually a big relief to know that I'm not, so important in the big plan, but I have some place, I have some position, I have some service if I would like it. And so in that sense, it's also extremely edifying and exciting to be able to recognize my influence, which I've come to frame in my own conception as Krishna trust in me. That's my power is the degree to which Krishna has trusted me with being able to take care of and offer support and nourishment to his children, to those he cares about and loves as much as he loves me and everyone else. And so my demonstration of that recognition of his trust is my service, which happens to be connected to power. But when I lose the focus on the power in terms of how I'm being entrusted, it keeps me in that sober place. Okay, we're running right up to an hour, so I'm going to just open it up for a kind of a closing argument from our pundits, or a closing statement. I'll make mine briefly, and then just go around. My own, I'll kind of frame it in the sense of that question I posed that I'd like to close us with, which is how, as a spiritual organization, could we improve our relationship to power? And Harivilasa, you just said something really important, which I want to ask you about later. You said you created channels of open communication as much as you could, right? Just creating that opportunity for people to express their concern. Because that's what I've found, is that criticism is actually just a concern someone has that they feel they're not allowed to share. And when they feel suppressed, that I can't say this to the, whomever that would have actual influence, then it comes out as a criticism. And so I've also myself been trying over the last 2 years, especially, to create these channels of healthy communication infrastructure and a clear sense of the hierarchy. So how can you get rid of me if you really want to, without having to create some like political intrigue? Just in a very straightforward manner, how can you establish that I shouldn't be in that service anymore? And how do you establish somebody else in that service and hold others accountable also in their service, and express concerns without becoming personal or vindictive? So that accountability infrastructure is actually very empowering. It lets people know they're going to be safe to express themselves, to have feelings that aren't necessarily in line with the powers that be, and they won't be swept under the rug, or there won't be a hit on them later from the local mafia if they don't get along. And so I've been trying myself to create that, and I see it as a great need in spiritual societies everywhere, and particularly within the devotee community, to create that infrastructure so that clear accountability and communication can be there. Vrindasundari, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I think there's certain formats that we could be using, that we could sort of, I don't want to say standardize, but we could just make more, we could educate more, how to communicate a concern in a way that's not vindictive, and it doesn't have to be. And basically to normalize feedback structures. There are, there are corporations that have feedback structures. Why can't we have one, And I think, like you said, it would be really helpful, because then, criticism, like you said, it's really just a need to express one's concerns. So there are feedback structures. I mean, basic communication structures, how, using I statements, instead of saying you're like this, not going to character analysis, or instead going to actions like I saw you do this, it felt like this, instead of like you're bad, you're dumb.
Making an absolute out of somebody's action.
Yeah, so there's certain ways. There's like, I think that we just need more education, and then we can normalize certain feedback structures and communication tools. It's out there.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great point too, is that these dynamics have been figured out in other places by other people, and it's working in such a way we can know they're in harmony with Krishna's, Madan Gopal was mentioning the executive, and that's how companies run. They have a board, and the board gives their input, and there's discussion, and there's, seeing it from all perspectives. At the end of the day, though, there's a person who's expected, the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, will make the decision. And if the decision turns out to not be healthy, they're removed. And if it is, then they get their bonus. So that presence of an executive is there in most healthy organizations, and a kind of unavoidable dynamic, just to speak from that principal place again, given that we're on the Polis, that's our intention here. Madan Gopal Prabhu, what's your take on this? How one thing spiritual organizations in general can do to increase their healthy power?
Yeah. So I think the alignment of, we should embrace the understanding of servant leader, moving beyond the transactional aspects of management, and instead actively, seek to develop and align our group's sense of purpose with our actual spiritual mission, and get everyone excited about it, be excited ourselves, and thoroughly saturated with an atmosphere of compassion and empathy, where we feel each other's pain. If we can combine those two very important aspects of leadership and power, we can make very quick progress while also attracting people, because there's not much love out there in the world.
No.
This is our flagship product is empathy and love. And when someone feels that, they'll never leave, and they'll continue growing in that organization.
Yeah, beautifully put, right? That somebody comes into a spiritual organization and they have that hope, right? There's that expectation it should be different here. These people should be leading from love, but then they may not always get that experience, and then they give up hope, if they're just like everyone else, everything else I've ever dealt with. And so nihilism sets in. Yeah, wonderful point. Harivilasa, what you got for us? Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
So just to confirm, so the broad question is, what can, just like sort of a closing statement, I guess, what a spiritual organization can do to increase healthy power?
Yeah.
Well, I really like Sundari's point the most about the fact that it only works if everybody uses their power. And I think we have oftentimes, at least what I see here in the society, the real challenge we have is that there are some people that are actually enthusiastic who want to do something, but I just can't, somehow I can't facilitate, we just have to facilitate the people that are already enthusiastic, that have some time and want to do something. And I think at least here at this project, I see the value, because it was a project that sort of collapsed. So there was a great vacuum, and I saw that vacuum was probably one of the best things that could have ever happened, because it pulled so many people out from the woodworks, people who were just sort of waiting and didn't have something to do, but now they could come. And I think to create a proper, to give people a shot, I think that's like something that really works, to somehow facilitate those who are already enthusiastic. And I find that's sort of the big challenge. And I see the more I do that, the more everything goes, because then you have these people who come, who are willing to actually they're willing to take responsibility for their power, for the power that they have. They're willing to come and invest that. And if we can facilitate these people, then the organization will grow. And to have a focus on that is not easy, but it's the only thing that can work.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work to create that sense of interdependent responsibility, but I would agree with you that that's what's worth working for. That's the happy arrangement. Okay, thank you so much to each of you for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you to everyone who's watching at home. I totally forgot to even look at the comments. Noah Logan has something. He's saying, there is the idea of the vanguard party where the governing ideas are channeled through and interpreted by panels of experts that are able to execute policy efficiently and effectively. This decentralizes the power and allows for democratic systems to be solidified and executed correctly. Yeah, that's in an ideal representative democracy. That's something we covered in our last episode, is a kind of structural harmony of this idea that, everybody should have some influence and input, and yet there needs to be a kind of centralization of executive authority. Unfortunately, again, these days, there's more of an emphasis on natural law as in terms of what it can bring me. So natural rights versus natural responsibility. What can I get versus what can I give? And I like how a lot of the conversation this evening has centered around, and the inspiration for you devotees being leaders is that you see an opportunity to give something, not that you get to sit on top of the hill and get the biggest plate of food first and the comfiest seat, but that there's a chance to do more for more people. And that's what you're asking from Krishna to have the opportunity to do, and you see it in that sense. Thank you, Noah, for that. Okay, so thank you again so much. Hopefully we can have you back on. This was a wonderful discussion, and I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you to everyone at home watching. Please keep an eye out on Bodica. We've got lots of fun shows, and we're going to continue with this On the Polis segment for a few more episodes. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you.